Hi and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day no matter what it is you're doing today. What I'd like to show you is a tutorial based on a Jessie James Beads mix box. This is the Blackberry Baby, or Blackberry Babe as I keep calling it. And I'm going to show you quite a bohemian style necklace, things that you can do with almost any beads, but works really, really well with this bead selection. I'm working with raw copper wire in a selection of gauges, which I'll show you on the board when we get to those stages of the tutorial. So if you'd like to join me down at the board, I will show you the piece a little bit more closely. So here's the piece that we're going to be looking at recreating today. We're using some of the beautiful beads from the mini mix, which is Blackberry Baby. I keep calling it Blackberry Babe because, well, that's what I'd have called it. So there's a couple of different techniques which you can use with all sorts of different beads, but I particularly like the way that the copper and the rose gold tone on the chain really complements the gorgeous glossy blackness of the bead mix. So I'll just pop the necklace out of the way and then we'll have a closer look at those beads. So you get a lovely variety. I particularly like these geometric pieces and these absolutely gorgeous little flower, almost like an anti-daisy. The black and white pieces, love those as well. And the gorgeous nature of the variety that you have in the tassels, absolutely fabulous. And a couple of different colourways on those spacer beads. So we'll crack on in just a moment with a little bit more about how we can recreate the Blackberry Baby Bohemian necklace. So the first piece that I want to show you how to create is this little doohickey here. So we're going to be using 3 of the small flared, almost like cylinders, but they're trumpet shaped. So I picked 3 of those out, and we're also going to be using a couple of spacer beads and one of the heavier faceted beads as well. So I'm just going to grab those like so, and the extra wire that we'll need. So if I just pop this over in the corner for reference, and we'll just look at the one piece at a time. That's what we're looking to recreate right now, so that's up in the corner for you to refer to. Now the wire that I'm going to use for this first section of the tutorial, and this is what we're going to create. If you have fine headpins, you can absolutely use your long fine headpins, but I want to show you how to kind of create your own for now. So I'm using 24 gauge or 0.5mm wire, and it's around about 2.5 to 3 inches in length. Utilising my round nose pliers, I'm going to put a small coil on one end, and I'm going to try and replicate the size and style of the coil. Now this is different to our usual coils because it comes up through the centre and starts radiating out and round. So this in effect is what will happen. That will come up through and then it will become a coil of its own right. So I will make my life easier and work from the outside in. So what I want to do is to start off with quite a large circle, like so, that's approximately just a little bit larger than the end of these beads. So that's a little bit on the large side. So I'm going to pop back in with my bent chain nose pliers just to bring that round slightly. And what I'm going to do is, once I've found that I'm happy with that outer shape and it's approximately the right kind of size, I'm just going to set that by very, very gently opening and closing the flat face of my pliers on that form. I'm then going to start drawing the long tail of the wire inside to create like a reverse coil. So it's very small movements, little by little, just drawing that around. If you need to tighten that up, you absolutely can. And I'm going to grip those 2 sections together as I bring the long tail of the coil round towards the centre. And when you find that you're running out of places to take that coil, as we are about to now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my pliers over so that the finer point comes in. If I turn it up this way, you'll see I'm going to grip just here where the coil has basically run out of steam, and I'm going to pull sharply up and away from the coil centre so that I have a coil on the end of a long pin. Now you may like to take a moment just to try and centralise that upright into the very middle, and it's just a case of moving that over until it sits correctly. And you're looking to have the replica of a flat disc, a coil disc on the end, and then straight wire coming up and away. So you can see that's ever so slightly out of shape, so I just take a moment to give that a gentle squeeze to just straighten up the central part of this piece, making sure that that's in the middle, or as in the middle as I can get it to be. And then we're going to slide the cone type bead wide end first down so that it sits over the end of that coil. Just pop those tools out of the way for a second so they're not in the way. And this again is your 0.5 or 24 gauge wire. So now I have 3 lengths which I want to bring together, and I want to make sure that those beads are all the way down to the bottom and they're sitting on those coils that we've created. And now when you're working with beads, any bead, you need to be respectful that you're not going to shatter or break them, especially if they may be made out of glass or a similar material. So I'm just going to hold those carefully, assess that I'm happy with how they're sitting. They're not touching at the base just yet, because when I start twisting those 3 wires that are just inside my hand there, they will draw more closely together. So I'm now going to pinch those 3 beads and start drawing the tails of the wires together. So it's like turning a key. I'm gripping very firmly with my non-dominant hand, and you can see that those 3 beads are drawing closely together, but I'm not allowing it to get too tight just yet. That's because I don't want any undue stress on those beads. And I'm going to continue all the way along to the end. When you start getting towards the end, you will probably want to switch to some flat facing pliers. And I'm just going to twist that so that it all meshes together really neatly and nicely. We want this to stay together all the time, so you can spend a little more than you perhaps would want to, just to make that look super neat. Now the ends will almost certainly never be exactly the same length, so I'm just going to trim those away and pop that straight in the scrap pot out of the way. Small pieces of wire like that can get stuck into pets or clothing or your own feet, and we don't want that. So that's the kind of form that we're looking to create to begin with. And what I'm going to do is, as I say, just make sure that I'm really happy with that twisting. It looks quite nice today, actually. Sometimes what can happen when you grip those 3 wires and start twisting them like a key, whichever is your preferred direction, you can get 2 that clump together and 1 that becomes a little out of whack, and it just doesn't quite create the same neatness of wire. So do take your time to get that nice tension and a good straight, now quite strong section of wire. Now of course you can add any spacers that you want, but I'm looking to replicate the design we've got up here, which is one of the larger, really pretty rhinestone style, I suppose, spacer beads. I'm going to pop that on the top first, like so, and you can spend some time later just opening those out as you prefer. And then the second piece is the gold tone with the black stones, and just allow that to slide down. Like I say, you can use anything that really fits. When you're passing any bead, especially glass beads, onto wire, you just need to be sure that they're going to be comfortable. So you can recreate this exactly, you can recreate it just using the techniques. There's a million things that you can do with a bead box from Jessie James, and that's why I love the inspiration that comes with them. So I'll show you now how to add on a link, which is almost the same as rosary linking. And again, that's something that you can utilise almost anywhere in wirework jewellery. For the next section, I'm going to use a slightly heavier piece of wire. Now this is raw copper, it's around about 2 inches worth. And this is 18 gauge or 1mm gauge wire. And what I'm going to do is make sure that my chosen bead will fit happily on there. Have a look at that centralised and make sure I've got at least 1 inch either side, or almost 1 inch either side, to play with. So what I'm looking to create is a rosary bead link. This is a double wrapped loop at one end and what will become a double wrapped loop at the other end. But first we need to turn our little trilogy of beads with those spacers into a loop as well. We need to have that have a hanging loop. So I'm going to pop in with those bent chain nose pliers, and I'm just going to very, very gently hold the upright that we made with twisted wire. And I'm going to push forwards on that design like so. So it's coming 90 degrees forwards from those three, I want to call them bugle beads, but I know that's not what they are. They look like little bugles. Then I'm going to come back in with those round nose pliers and create a small loop. So we've got this twisted tail of wire up at the top here. I'm just going to very, very gently, small movements, turn that around until I have the half loop shape, draw the tail over the end, and then just make really quite a small loop at the top before switching to my bent chain nose pliers to bring that tail around. Now it pays here to have chain nose and bent chain nose, or two bent chain nose pliers. I'm going to support that loop very, very gently, and then I'm going to draw the tail of wire around the upright post that we created with those twisted three lighter gauge wires. At this point, you can decide if you want to flare the beads out slightly. You've got a couple of options with how you want that to sit. They can all sit flat, or you can have a little bit of 3D movement to them so that they come forwards when they're being worn. And then you can see those coils on the bottom. Looks a little bit like a Pyro clown. Sad clowns that were famous in the 1980s. Thank you, David Bowie, for that. Everybody was mad for them. So there's one of our components, which I'll just pop up to the side. Now, to elongate almost any drop design, you can pop another rosary linked bead in. So this is what we're looking to create. I've wrapped one of these end loops, and then there's a second end loop which is half done, and I'm just going to show you how to connect this to the piece we've just created. So we've got that tail, and I'm going to pop that through the open loop, close that up. You can close that up with your bent chain nose pliers, and then bring the tail around. Now again, I would be very, very careful twisting wire next to a glass bead. And what we're going to do is support the loop that we've created and draw that tail around. So sometimes it can take getting used to be using two tools rather than one hand and a tool, but with a little practice it does become more fluid. So that's how we can add in an extender drop. And to create that extender drop, what I tend to do is pop my bead into position first, put one pair of bent chain nose pliers on one side and put a lovely firm right angle bend in, and then flip that over the other side, hold the bead into position with my nail, pop the bent chain nose pliers in at the other end and put another bend on. And in this way I know I've got enough space and relatively equal lengths of wire to create those loops. So if I show you one of those, very, very simple. We're going to roll around the round nose pliers until you've got half a loop, and then we're going to draw the tail all the way up and over. You can size that down if you wish to make it a slightly smaller loop. I'm going to support that, and then I'm going to do one turn with that wire. If you find that uncomfortable on your fingers, you can use your pliers to do that, and I'll show you how now. I'm just going to re-straighten that end section before I put that half loop in with the pliers. So I've got my half loop, pop the pliers back in, and then draw the tail over the end. If that isn't quite centralised, you can roll the loop along slightly and straighten that up. Now, if you want to close that completely with pliers, I'm going to have to flip that over because I'm right dominant. So I'm going to support only the loop, not where those two wires cross over. And then I'm going to use my second pair of bent chain nose pliers to draw the tail around. When I'm creating a closed rosary link bead such as this, what I will tend to do is wrap a little at either end to make sure that my wraps will be equal and symmetrical. So I've wrapped 1.5 times on what is currently the right hand side, so I'm going to do the exact same thing on the left before assessing how much space I have available, and I think I'll be able to get all of the wire wrapped away. So I'm going to take that all the way over to the end and flip. Support just the loop, not where the wires cross over. And then draw that tail up and firmly around the spine or the spindle or the core wire that goes through the bead. That can now be used to extend any dropper, and joining them together, you would just leave one of those open. I have a dedicated tutorial for rosary linking if you'd like to watch that. Remind me at the end of the tutorial and I'll pop a link in for you. So there's our first piece. I'll just drop that down there. We're going to move on to another couple of almost mini demos, but once you've mastered those, you can put them all together to recreate the Blackberry Baby Bohemian necklace, or Blackberry Babe as I keep calling it. So for the next mini tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make this little dropper here. And it's quite cool, quite unique. What we're going to do is pop a loop through the bead, hang a little chain down the back, and then run a wrapped loop at the top. They're quite cool. You can use them with any kind of top forward drilled bead. So here's the piece that we're going to work with. And the wire I'm using is 18 gauge, which is equivalent to 1mm wire. Again, it's raw copper. And I'm just going to give that a quick smooth through to make sure it's warm and free of any kinks. First thing I'm going to do is to make a really nice coil to begin with, and like most of my coils, I like to do 2 full circuits. So I'm going to start off with the round nose pliers, creating a roundish form, like so. Before I remove those round pliers, switch to my flat. Any flat pliers will do, but I'm using my bent chain nose pliers. Doesn't need to have any gaps in it, so we're just going to complete 2 circuits, and I'll show you exactly what I mean when I get there. So we've got a start point around once, around a second time, and then we're going to stop. What I'm going to do is just give that a really good squeeze to make sure that that's nice and set. And then I'm going to pop my pliers across that loop that we've just created, or coil. And what I want to do is take the wire down and away at 90 degrees, like so. Ideally, if the wire can pass central point through the loop, because what we want to do is to have that coming through the bead and sitting up and proud. Now you could have that sitting down over the face of the bead if you prefer. It doesn't really matter, it's entirely up to you. I quite like it sitting up and away, because what it means I can do very, very carefully is pinch that back towards the back of the bead. What I'm going to do here is use my pliers to generate a bend behind that where the hole is in the bead and draw the wire up. Again, if you are working with a bead that is more delicate, such as a glass bead, then you would want to proceed with caution. This is a really very good natured bead, and I don't anticipate it will give you much of any problems. So once that's pinched into position, that's just going to sit and dangle quite prettily. So what we want to do now, the reason we had just a tiny gap at the back, I've got a length of scrap chain here. It's not exactly the same chain as the piece on the demonstration model, but it will enable me to show you. Take your chosen length of chain, whatever length you've decided, and if you're making multiples, these make fabulous earrings. Just make sure that you count the same number of loops or measure that. So it's literally just slid down over that chain and onto the behind section where the wire came out through that through drill bead hole. So what we're going to do now is create another wrapped loop, and we're going to have that coming forwards so that this sits flat on the necklace piece. So again, bent chain nose pliers, gripping that upright wire. If I turn it sideways, I'm going to push that forwards really sharply at 90 degrees. Round nose pliers, you're going to get sick of wrapped loops by the end of today. Take that halfway round with your pliers, so you can see you've got half a loop there. Pop the pliers back in. You can roll that if you need to. Bring the tail up very, very gently and over to complete that circle form. Before we pop back in with any flat pliers, and again, when I grip a loop like this, I'm only gripping the circuit. I'm not gripping where those 2 wires cross over. Now we've got quite a lot of wire left over here. So you can take the wraps as many times as you feel comfortable. I'm just going to go for 2.5 wraps. I'm going to squeeze that firmly closed, making sure that I can keep that upright and at 90 degrees to the bead. I'm just going to have a look at the back of the bead now, trim the excess of wire away. I'm going to allow that to drop for a second. And then what I need to do is make sure that there are no sharp edges. So I'm going to tighten up that coil like so. You may again prefer to use 2 bent chain nose pliers for this. I'm going to grip hold of the wrapped loop again, only where the wire is in the circular form, not where it crosses over. And I'm just going to squash down the tail of the wire where we just cut away, so that you get 3 wrapped around the core, and you've still got that forward facing loop so that it will sit flat on the neckline when you add it to the neck piece. So for the next mini tutorial on today's Blackberry Baby Bohemian necklace, I'm going to show you a really lovely floral kind of design in wire, enhanced with one of the black and white beads from this beautiful bead pot. So this is the piece that we're going to create next, a lovely floral design. And you can make this in slightly heavier wire if you wish to use a 16 gauge, which is 1.25, but today I am working with 18 gauge, which is 1mm. I'm also going to use one of these really beautiful beads from the bead collection, black and white but super shiny as well. So for this, I'm definitely going to need my round nose pliers. I'm also going to want to make sure that the ends of my wire are trimmed neatly. If you have the burr cup device or tool, you can definitely use that to smooth away those ends. You may have excess at the end which needs further trimming anyway. Now for this one, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 petals. I find that with this design, an odd number of petals work, so you could go for 5 or 7, or if you wanted to, you could even try and get 9 in there, but they do tend to get quite large when you try that. In terms of wire, I have around about 6 inches of that 18 gauge 1mm wire. Round nose pliers to begin with. Now what I'm going to do to start off with is just to generate around about midpoint on my pliers the start of what could be a loop. What I'm then going to do is switch to my bent chain nose pliers and just open that out ever so slightly. Take my pliers opposite where the start of the wire is and draw that very sharply back on itself. So if I just hold it like so, you should be able to see where we're going with this. And I'm just going to make sure that that comes as far back as I can possibly get it, like so. I'm going to squeeze that down flat between my pliers to begin with, then I'm going to support it and bring that quite close together but not completely closed up. For the next section, I'm going to repeat the design. So I'm popping those pliers in at approximately the same point, and then what I'm going to do is roll that wire around until I can replicate a petal approximately the same size as the first one. So it's a case of just doing that little by little. Give that a gentle squeeze, create your next bend, and you'll notice they're not completely tight together because you have an opportunity just to tighten that up as you go. So again, I'm just going to squeeze the petal form like so before I tighten up the bend, and then very gently bring that back around. So you will get quite quick at these if you do enough of them. But obviously you want to be happy with the final outcome. So they'll work in most wires. You could take this up to a 20 gauge or 0.8mm if you prefer. Don't rush it to begin with. So I've created that bend going backwards, and I can see that I've just come a little bit too far. So what I'm going to do to fix that is just open that out and draw it closer at the top. So I've got a very open centre to my flower because that means I can close the petals up as and when I want to. So again, tightening up the point, supporting both of those wire sections and pinching to draw that around. So I think I'm going to make a 5 petal flower. If you're wanting to recreate the design in the corner, which is a 7-petal flower, you could make these slightly larger and keep them slightly further apart. So drawing the tail of the wire round, I'm quite happy with the shape of this particular petal, so I will set the shape by nom-nomming, as it were, with those bent chain nose pliers. Before popping in, I'm doing this upside down so you can hopefully see that slightly better. Draw the wire back on itself and out and away. Have a look at how that's sitting. If it's not sitting quite right, you can move that around slightly until it does. That looks pretty good, so I'm going to give that a quick squeeze before I draw the long tail of wire again back up at the top, support the petal and the long tail, and then just give that a gentle squeeze as well. Now you might find that actually you wanted to make 7 instead. The reason I go for odd numbers is because then you have a petal at the bottom and it's opposite to the upright, which becomes the wrapped loop up at the top. So let's roll that next petal around, draw the tail of wire over the centre of the design again. Quite happy with that. Let's give that a squeeze and then bring the wire back on itself. Now, if I want to make this into a 5-petal flower, I just need to move things around ever so slightly. So I'm just going to draw this central wire. Let's say this is where I want to end. So I'm going to flatten everything down with the flat faces of my bent chain nose pliers before I start opening these petals up a little. So there's 1, 2, 3. And if I squeeze that together, it should come around and look reasonably flowery. So it was on its way to forming a 7-petal flower like the demonstration piece, but the process is exactly the same and I didn't want you to get bored. So we're just going to tighten up that last upright very, very gently before we pop that gorgeous faceted black and white bead on the neck of the design. You don't have to have that there if you don't want to. I'd actually quite like to see a necklace made with just these flowers, alternating between with a bead, without a bead, with a bead, without a bead. I think that would look really pretty. And then to finish that off, we're just going to make sure that the 2 ends sit side by side. You're happy with the shape and form, and give that a really hearty squash before creating another one of those wrapped loops. And I will just go through this quite quickly. So a forwards bend, round nose pliers, and we're going to use a 2-move technique. Roll the pliers into position so you get half a loop, draw the tail around for the second half of the loop. Squash that into position, hold only the loop section, not the crossed wire, and then draw that tail around, cutting away the residue. Now we've done a couple of wrapped loops so far on today's tutorial, so that's the reason I'm going through that a little speedily. If you're catching up on replay, you can always check back and see that in full detail at the beginning of the video tutorial. So I'm just going to make sure that the loop at the top is sitting 90 degrees to the design, so that when these sit on the neckline, they will all be in the correct orientation, like so. So for the last piece of our Blackberry Baby Bohemian necklace, I'm going to show you the centerpiece. Now I'm sure that you've seen opening and closing jump rings, adding to a chain before. It's a very, very popular design. So what I've done is I've added a section to the bottom and to the top of that chain to make it a little bit more interesting. And then if you've never seen anybody link a bead to a chain in an upright cluster, I'll show you one time just at the end. So we have our center section here, which is a length of chain with a bead at the bottom and a bead at the top, with those additional clustered sections in the middle. So I'm going to show you how to create the one at the bottom first, which is with this oversized, flared, beautiful, shiny black bead. Very, very simple. Now there's very little weight on this, so I'm going to show you how to make an open loop for the bottom of our section of chain. If you are working in raw copper like I am today, you will find a lot more chain is available in a rose gold colourway, and they do match really quite well together. If you're lucky enough to get raw copper chain, then absolutely fantastic. So I have here around about 4 inches of 18 gauge or 1mm wire, and I'm going to start with my round nose pliers at one end by creating quite a tight coil, like so, before switching to my bent chain nose pliers. And because this is quite a large bead, I'm going to run 3 times around that central loop shape to reflect the size of the bead. So normally I would kind of go for 2 because it's just aesthetically pleasing. So I've gone, here's my start point, once, twice and 3 times around. And what I want to do is get quite a sharp upright bend. Now there's a number of ways that you can do this, but the most successful I've found is to take the tip of your pliers in, and as you make that upright, just push in slightly against your start point. You'll need to keep that flat. If that does come out of flat, you can just give that a tiny squish. I'm going to make sure that that's a good solid inch or so of wire by very, very gently squeezing just at the base there. Then I'm going to slide on my large flared bead to replicate that section at the bottom of the chain. Now you could do another wrapped loop if you'd like to, but what I'm going to do is show you how to just create an open loop. So rather than coming forwards, which you can do if you prefer, but I like the way it matches with the coil at the bottom, I'm just going to use an open loop at the top. So the technique is very, very similar. I'm going to roll those pliers around until I get half a loop, and then take the tail over the top to complete that loop. Now you could wrap around that neck if you wanted to, but if you want to use this as an open loop, we're going to come in with those flush cutters just at the point on the residue of wire where it crosses the neck of the piece. Always pop your pliers in, or your cutters in rather, and take a look, check and check again before you press cut. It's disheartening when you cut the wrong part. So what I'm going to do is just close that up so that I've got a complete loop at the top there, and give that really a very firm squeeze, making sure you don't accidentally squash your bead at the top there. So I'm giving this a lot of work hardening and almost flattening the wire slightly. It's not making it square, don't worry. But I've given that a really good squeeze. Now sometimes the loop will open ever so slightly during that process. So what you can do is, much like a jump ring, open that slightly sideways, very, very gently push the end closed and draw it back into position. Give that another squeeze, and now you've got a really functional closed, open and closed loop. So I'm just going to pull that forwards, and this will become the bottom of the tassel design, which is the centerpiece of the necklace. Close the loop, again give that a squeeze, and that will last a very long time, unless of course your small child or dog decides to pull on the end. So what we're going to do now is to create a linking section at the top, which is a little bit more complex than that rosary style wrapped loop, double wrapped loop rather, that we made earlier. You could use one of those if you wanted to attach the chain. You could very, very simply slide the chain onto your threading material. I would be using a 0.38mm gauge tiger tail, such as this. But any threading material that works for you and goes through all of those beads will be absolutely fine. If you want something a little bit more exotic at the top there, I've got one of these really smooth, kind of chubby oval beads. Let's just pop those out of the way for a second. I'm going to work again with some 18 gauge or 1mm wire. I have here about 7 inches, and I'm just going to smooth that so that it's nice and warm first. And we're going to make a really exciting variation on that rosary linked chain. So again, just smoothing that through, putting some heat and straightness into it and making it super shiny. I'm going to trim those ends away. If you see me working with wire and I don't mention trimming the ends away, it's because I happened on the good side of a cut. Please do always make sure that those are nice and neat. So what we're going to do is to slide this section into the centre of our approximately 7 inches of wire, and we're just going to have some fun now. So if the bead is centralised, let me just move that up and out of the way. The bead is centralised. I'm going to pop the bent chain nose pliers in on one side and put a right angle bend. Flip the design over, and repeat on the other side. So what I'm doing is I'm allowing a very small amount of space for a couple of turns of wire. So if you imagine, I could probably get 3 wraps just in here. So what I'm going to do is put a wrapped loop on one end, and this will be the section that can go onto the necklace itself. So all the way around with that to create my wrapped loop, like so. And then I'm going to wrap, I think probably just twice, like so, around the core wire. And what I'm doing here is I'm not pressing hard, I'm just tidying and neatening that away. So what we could do on the other end, we can either add the chain at this point, or you can add with a jump ring later. Now this makes it very much easier for me to show to you by using a jump ring later. If you want a more seamless piece, or you don't have a jump ring to hand, during the next section what I'll do is I'll put the chain onto the loop, show you how you would close it up, and then I'll take that off again, because as I say, it's easier to show you. If you want to link your rosary link together, it's the same process. So what I'm going to do is to create that loop. So I'm using the pliers to generate that round shape, rolling them round if I need to, and drawing that tail over. Now there's a small gap at this stage. If I want to add my chain, what I will do is slide that into position and just hold that out of the way whilst I wrap around the core exactly the same as we did at this end. And that is exactly the same way, let me just slide this out of the way now, that you would add on another rosary link bead. So they just interlink, but you have one end open like this. Before you do the next section, which is wrapping that closed, you would then ensure that you add in the next link. So I'll tell you what, let's just go for it. Let's just put the chain in. So I've put my drop chain in, and this works exactly the same whether I've put another bead link in or a charm, for instance. What we're going to do is to support that circular frame, but we need to be slightly careful, because now we've just got to support the centre. We can't squash the link or the chain on this side, and we can't squash the point where the wires cross over on this end. So I'm just going to make sure that I've got a really good solid grip here, and then I'm going to take that tail all the way around, like so. So I've got my 2 wraps on either end, and at this stage you've basically got the opportunity to turn these through 90 degrees just once. So what I tend to do is just leave that alone until I decide what I want to do with it, because I don't want to overstress the core wire. So really what we're going to do now is just play with these extended lengths of wire that we have around. What I might do is just take this one more time around the back, squeeze that so that it looks neat and tidy. And then I'm going to bring the tail residue from the bottom here and take that over the side of the bead, like so, and wrap it around the outside of the wrapping we've just done at the top, so at the top there. So what you need to do is just hover, really, and in very small movements take that tail so that it double wraps around the neck of your rosary linking section. So that's a much prettier side actually, so I would probably say this is the front, absolutely. If, as I say, you don't want to mess around too much having this tail in the way, you can certainly use a little jump ring later to add that on instead. So I'm going to add a little bit of heat and warmth into this piece before I draw that around the opposite side so that we're framing that bead and making a bigger deal out of it. So we're drawing the wire around the left hand side of that bead now, and I'm going to show you how to double wrap at the bottom and also how to add a little bit of extra interest. So to stop this wire from flipping over the surface of the bead, what I tend to do is pinch that bead whilst I'm drawing the wire round and over, like so. And then I'm going to take the long tail all the way around, so we're double wrapping again the double wrapped loop at the bottom there. So that's once and then twice. Now you can see that we've got a little bit of a tail of wire here left over at the bottom. So if you take those round nose pliers, you can generate a small coil or loop just to sit over, either upwards on the surface of the gemstone or over the base where our loop is, just to add a little further interest. So I'm just going to push that into position, and it's just something a little bit different because it looks like your chain is hanging out of nowhere. It's a little bit of an optical effect for you there. So if you've never seen how to cluster on beads like so, if it's a bead, then you can add yourself a head pin, or you can make the little wrapped pins that we made earlier in the very first design. But just for those of you who may never have seen the technique, get yourself some jump rings, open and close with a pair of bent chain nose pliers, and you twist them open. Pop that through your adding loop, pop it onto the chain, and then close that up. Now, there are really no rules with making your cluster drops when you're using chain. I'm closing up my jump ring so that it's nice and smooth. If I just lay that down for a second, what you can do is have similar pieces on opposite sides. What I tend to do to see what it looks like to begin with is use one loop one side of the chain and then go up a link on the other side of the chain and just back and forth until I see what the drop looks like. If it's a bit skinny, you can double up those charms or the drops or the tassels, whatever you fancy adding on. You can even add on random pieces. So for this one, I had a small section of wire left over which was wrapped into a coil. Put an open loop like we did on the base here, and just added that on as well. So you can really cluster these up. You can even add all of the charms that we made to that chain for your cluster designs, and then it becomes something really quite fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today here on the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you've had as much fun as I have. These bead boxes are so much fun and such good value. One of the reasons that I really love these is because you just get instant inspiration in a box. When you buy a strand of beads, that's absolutely fantastic. And you know me, I love my gemstone bead strands. They are the best. I do love my genuine gemstones, but a bead box will take you places that perhaps you wouldn't necessarily be inspired to go. I hope to see you back here again on the Gemhawks YouTube channel again very soon. Lots of love and bye for now.